And welcome everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Tim Jerome. I'll be hosting you. Welcome to another webinar hosted by Ijona Academy, the place to go to where you can learn to be a leader and grow and find experts and mentors to support you. Today, we're going to talk about project management and PMP preparation. This topic is going to be rather fascinating. This is one that I get a lot of questions on. I teach PMP prep. By the way, let me actually explain a couple things. I'm a project management trainer and mentor. Okay, I've been a project manager for about 20 odd years. I was really lucky because I got some experience across multiple industries. I was a consulting project manager, and I was brought in for major decision making in multinational corporations. So it was fascinating to see how people behave and how business is performed and decided upon inside major companies across the planet. And it made me think a lot. Well, 2012 came along, and so what happened to the rest of the world happened to me. I got the pink slip, and they said, good luck, you have a bunch of skills, we know you'll be successful. And I've been teaching people how to be managers and leaders since. This is my passion, to prepare people where you're often not prepared to be a manager, to be a leader, to run business, to manage projects, to do anything you can imagine. So with that in mind, I teach PMP preparation, right? So I teach people how to manage projects from start to end, every business component of it, right? Contracts, risk, scheduling, quality, resource management. Well, one of the questions they get when preparing for the PMP exam is, what's the source material and how are we going to wrap our minds around it? Now, primary source material is something called the body of knowledge for project management, or the PMBOK, the PMBOK. We're going to talk about that because it seems like a thick, dusty, very difficult document to get your mind into. I've been studying the various editions of the PMBOK since 2003, and I have been surprised at the depth, the clarity, the articulation of good practice and how it's represented and how it's become more and more evident and clear. And that's what I'm going to show to you today. How do I look at the PMBOK? And also, if I'm looking at the PMBOK, I'm taking a test on project management. Project management good practice makes sense. But the problem is, if you're preparing for this exam and you're reading the PMBOK one thing and you've been doing project management for the last 5 years another way, what's the right way? And how do I put this in context with my work? We're going to touch all those questions. There we go. So here we are. We're going to look at the book and we're going to review it. And I have my copy online so I can pull it up and we can look through the pages and the organization structure. But what I want to talk about is what's in it, how it's structured, and the influences, the context around the PMBOK and the structure itself. And then we're going to talk about topics inside the PMBOK that are evident. They're explicit. You can read them real easily. And then there are implicit topics that are sort of hidden. Now, I'm not going to show a lot of these to you, but I'll be able to show you many that you'll be surprised are hidden. It's rather fascinating once you start looking for all of these details, how articulate and how intricate various aspects of the PMBOK can be. So let's get our minds around the project management body of knowledge. It's a guide and a standard. What does that mean? It's 2 books. One book is the standard. It's the last 1/3 of the book, not included the appendices. This actually is the standard for project management. We'll look at that in a little while. That aligns with what we call ISO 21500, which is the ANSI standard, okay? Now, there's also a reference, sort of like an encyclopedia or Wikipedia. The guide is 2/3 of the material. That's what we usually think of as the PMBOK, is the supporting material for the index. It goes into greater detail. Now, as a body of knowledge, the PMBOK says this is a good way of doing things, and that's what we mean by good practice. If you do things this way, you can get things pretty reasonably successful. 50 authors get together every 4 years and put the PMBOK together, and they agree on what project success is and how to do various things inside of project management to get a better way of doing things. And that's what they debate, and they review, and they add, and they eliminate as they progress. We've been doing this for about, 20 years now, since 1996. Actually, it goes way back before then. There was a project in the late 1980s that Project Management Institute approved of. It said, let's put together a body of knowledge of project management. We have a bunch of good ideas, but let's go ahead and standardize and codify this, and then we can actually start working with it. Well, it took a few years, right? And pulled it together. And to put this in context, the credential, the PMP credential, Project Management Professional credential that I was talking about, it's been around since 1984. So it's sort of strange that you'd have the credential over here, and then a little bit later, you have the standard placed out. But all's well and good. Everything worked together, and they got what they needed. And 1996 rolls around. They have one codified standard now. It wasn't until, what was it, the 2000 version of the project management body of knowledge that it aligned with any standards. And that was the ANSI, or American National Standards Institute standard for quality management. And then by the 4th edition, they were aligning with the International Standard Organization. So they pride themselves in being, this is the way project management is generally done. The end, right? That's what a standard says. It's aligned with that. But also, it's good practice. Again, when I say good practice, it's the right way of doing things. But it also means if you do it this way, you're generally going to be more successful, and you're not going to allow failure to take over your project. Well, that's good to know. Okay, and this changes, by the way, every 4 years. We're on the 6th edition right now. Each one of the PMBOK guides has a piece of the history of the development of project management and the project management standards. So if you're interested in pulling up this material, you only have to get copies of the 4th, 5th, and 6th edition, and they'll give you the whole history to date. But anyway, every 4 years, a new PMBOK comes up. The 6th edition came up in 2017, and we're still working on it. They just called for authors. By the way, this is December of 2019. They just pulled their authors together in fall of 2019. So probably in a year and a half, 2 years, we should start seeing it. If you're a member of Project Management Institute and you have your PMP, your project management professional credential, they may call on you to review a little bit. They do that randomly from time to time. It's a really wonderful thing to see rough drafts of these documents that are going to become really formal at some point. Now, that's a big thing. We have one way of doing projects, and we have projects that are in multiple industries, right? Finance, banking, fuel and oil, construction, legal, healthcare, information technology. They all have projects. And the project management body of knowledge says, doesn't matter which industry you're in. This is the standard, and this is how you generally do a project. Well, right on page 2 of the PMBOK, it also says one of the parts of project management is the appropriate use of a standard or the appropriate use of good practice, which means if you need to change, you're going to change. And so the 6th edition actually said tailoring is important. It's on the 2nd page of the standard. You're going to have to modify this because projects are different, deliverables are different, organizations are different, organizational preference are different, everything's different. And sometimes you put more emphasis on risk, sometimes you put more emphasis on budget, but every project basically has these components. So this is a big thing, and the project management guide, body of knowledge, is a really big thing too. The problem is it's not easy to read, right? Whether we're talking about the standard or the guide, it's a lot easier to read now. The new edition actually standardized a lot of terminology. They already had to a great extent in the 5th edition, but the 6th edition went even further, and it made it very readable. If you look at any other standards like telecommunications, for instance, right? There is a Telecordia standard that tells you how to build data centers and central offices and those kind of things. And it's very hard to read and it's very dry, right? The PMBOK is remarkably not so dry. I'll show you some things in it. And it's laid out in a really interesting way. The standard progresses through the information of what a project is and what the details are, and we'll look at that in a minute. And the guide actually aligns with the standard and connects to minor detail, and it provides background information as well. Now, again, it's not just readability that the 6th edition brings, it's understandability. For instance, like I say, there are things that are really well documented and they're very clear. But even the implicit, even the hidden information, once you know where to look for it, it makes total sense. Now, another thing that the project management body of knowledge did, they added something that came about 2015 after a series of surveys. The Project Management Institute in 2015 released what they call the talent triangle. These are the areas of knowledge that well, I don't want to call them knowledge areas. They're competences. That's the word for it. All right, they're skills that a project manager should develop. And up to that point, PMI said, well, you need scope, schedule, cost, right? You need quality, risk, and purchasing. And you need to work with your team, you need to work with stakeholders, you need some variation of communication, and you need to manage communication, not just do it. And then there has to be some type of tying it all together, and they call that integration management, okay? All of that in 2015 said, PMI said, this we're going to call technical project management. It's not technology like databases or the internet or anything like that. It's technical, which means it's very specific, it's very measurable, very quantifiable. And they added it 2 areas. One of them is leadership, right? Leadership and management. Leadership is a strategy, and it's the influencing and motivating people. And management is Excel spreadsheets and measuring and inspecting, right? And it's directing people. And they said, we need to get better at this. You know, surveys have told us this, that project managers need to grow their skills, especially looking forward over the next 20 years, but also business management. Project managers need to invest in this. Business management is the context, it's the background, it's the area or the medium within which projects exist. And so if you understand the context and the background, you understand the why of projects a lot better. And so PMI said, we're over the next decade, all you members of PMI, we're going to help you. We're going to help you develop your leadership. We're going to help you develop your understanding of business and business acumen. So this, again, is a major change. So all of a sudden, it's not just about 10 knowledge areas, 5 process groups, and 49 processes that the PMBOK represents. Project management brings in a whole different dimension. You have to lead and manage, you have to understand business, and then on top of that, you have to be able to do what we're doing here. It seems like an extra burden, but actually it's not all that much more information. It's just the way the information is organized. We've been talking about business as an influence since back at least 2003. That's when I was preparing for my exam, and the materials always had a discussion of business influences, right? What are the things that business can bring to us that will impact the project? So all it was doing was bring these to the forefront and say, this is important to everyone. Focus on this for the next few years and focus on this. Don't defocus on the others, but we'll reward you to focus on these. And that's pretty good because again, if you look, especially if you look at the writings of Peter Drucker and W.E. Deming over the mid to late 20th century and into the 21st century, the material that they had constantly said that in the 21st century, we're going to be transitioning from tactical workers, you know, like doing manual labor and doing mechanical things robots can replace, and we're going to be moving over to knowledge workers, innovation, managing and leading, facilitation, confrontation management, issue management, right? And so this is why the PMBOK is changing. PMI is embracing this, and the PMP credential evaluates people in this manner. Big deal, right? It's a huge deal. Now, what do we mean by context? Context is the background within which something exists, and it's the influencing background. It's the environment, right? For fish, it's the water or the ocean around them. For us, it's where we work, it's where we play, it's where we live with our family. Our family is part of our context. Our history is part of our context. So the context of the PMBOK is 2 things. Now, I already mentioned it, didn't I? I said the project management body of knowledge is to be considered good practice, right? If you follow these things, it'll make life easier, project will be more successful, and you'll have less failure, right? That's always good. Get advice and get some step-by-step ways of doing things that make your life easier. And it's also to be tailored, which means you're going to shape it. You, project manager, are going to be the one who actually modifies it. Now, do we get to do that in real life? To some extent, probably, but not to the extent we want. There's two things that actually influence the way we do projects and what makes it really hard to understand the project management body of knowledge. Number one, you have business requirement. Business tells you you have to do certain things certain ways, right? We have contracting. If you have a contract as part of your project, you have to engage attorneys. You have no choice. So these type of things, business requirements, require you to do certain things. And so you can't do what's written in the PMBOK exactly. You have to tailor it. But there's also something called preference. It's called organizational preference. It's the way they do business. An example of organizational preference would be, are they software developing organization? Are they a manufacturing organization? With software development, you get to be a little more flexible, right? You can actually have beta testing where the end user helps you develop the final portion of the deliverable itself. You can't do that in manufacturing automobiles, right? You can't have the client come in and buy the car 70% complete and then help you finish it. It just doesn't make sense. And so what we call that is organizational preference. They prefer to do it one or two ways. And that preference, as well as business requirements, shape the way we do projects. So a lot of people look at the PMBOK and say, this is where you have to do it. This doesn't make sense. Well, first of all, it's tailorable. You're going to modify it, and it says that in every chapter. Second of all, organizational requirement and preference are going to modify this highly, and you're the one with the common sense that's going to figure it out. Another thing that actually is sort of not clear enough when people come in for training and classes is the fact that it really doesn't match what they do. Their director or their supervisor make all the decisions, and they just manage the administrative part of the projects, right? Well, the PMBOK doesn't talk about people doing work. It talks about roles doing work. And in any organization, those roles may be distributed. And so you have to approach the PMBOK that way. Again, it's not a person, it's a role where your director or your supervisor may manage the budget. They may manage most of the risk, and you handle the incidentals and you handle the communication, and you just facilitate the decision making, right? You facilitate, you guide and direct it. And once you start understanding that, it starts making a lot of sense. Now, another way to think about the PMBOK here is that second bullet there. If you had no one to turn to, if you had a project and you had to do it and it was big, like a $10 million project, what were all the things you'd have to consider to run that project? And that's what the PMBOK represents. It's good practice, and it represents the role of the project manager. Now, we talked about organizational preference and requirement, but let's talk about good business practice. Okay, when you learn to be a project manager, you're not just learning to be a project manager, you're learning how to be a business manager. All of these things are grounded. Everything in the PMBOK is grounded on good business practice. They got a lot of this material from business school, from how you manage and lead people. When you go and take management courses or finance courses or legal courses, right? Everything's in there is just like that. So when you take and study the PMBOK, you're actually studying the way businesses run, not just projects. And that's key. When you start seeing that in the PMBOK and start seeing this is the way the organization works, well, yeah, now I make sense. This is the way purchasing is. Okay, I see what's going on. And that's the context. Now let's step back a little bit. Let's do a little field trip here, okay? I want to go through the structure of the PMBOK, and it's going to help us for the rest of our discussion. There's generally 4 pieces. You have a huge index, and you have the standard, and you have the guide, and then you have the appendices. Each one of those are important. The appendices are a lot larger and a lot more detailed than you'd expect. They're actually helping chapters or sections. There's 6 of them, and they have different roles to help you. And we'll look at a couple of them. We won't go through all of them. Okay. And yes, each one has its own various function. I'm going to pull up a copy of the project management body of knowledge, and let me get it for you here. And then I'll show you where you can get your copy. Let's see, where are we? Just a second here. And there we are. It'll take me just a second to load. The project management body of knowledge can be bought as a paperback, or if you're an active member in Project Management Institute, you get a copy of it for free. I use my free copy here, okay? I'm going to use some reference pages. If you have questions right now, or if you have questions post-session, please ask, and we can actually, I'll leave this document up so we can reference it real quickly. Let's see. So what we're talking about is the index, the structure, the standard, and the guide, or the appendices, and the PMBOK itself, okay? You can actually purchase it. Project Management Institute is the publisher. This is their website. This is the United States primary nonprofit organization for project management. This is where, if you're interested in getting your PMP, you'll go to sign up. You need approval from PMI to take it. There's other things here, but today we're going to look at the guidance standard. You can find a lot of information here, and I'm just going to go to their page, okay? But you can also find a lot more information. Price is $99 for a new one, and it's $50 for a new one. And again, we're talking about a soft bound copy. There's no hard bound you can buy. The paper's a little flimsy. It's good. It's a good reference book, but you are going to eventually have it, you know, forever on your shelf, and it'll be coffee stained, and it'll have worn edges and corners on the pages and that kind of thing. It's not really high quality stock, but that's not the intent. It costs $99 if you're not a member of PMI, and $50 if you are a member. Or you can do what I do, is be an active member and log in and download. If you're interested in being an active member and you have questions, I can talk about it. I am a leader in a local chapter, Project Management Institute, and I talk about this all the time. So you can download it, right? And once you download it, you get a PDF that roughly looks like this. For right now, Project Management Institute is bundling both the project management body of knowledge and the Agile practice guide, which is also published by PMI. They're bundling them together, which is rather handy. The index is rather broad. You'll notice we'll start right here on page 1 to the guide. And it does just that. It literally guides you through. It gives you an overview, an environment or context, and then it talks about general topics before we get into the mechanics of projects and project management itself, right? It sets the environment, sets the stage for further discussion. And then the guide breaks down all of the knowledge areas. Now, for those of you who may not have been introduced to this, there are 10 knowledge areas and 5 process groups in the framework that we're talking about. You know, we're talking about the ISO 21500 standard. There's initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, or closing, or as you may know, gaining project approval, putting together a stepwise plan, leading and directing work, inspecting, making decisions, making changes, and then transitioning the deliverable to the final owner. Yeah, those are groups of processes, but we also have knowledge areas, and I'm zooming out here so you can see that there's 10 of them. And again, the 10 are scope, schedule, cost, right? Those are the 3 baselines. Those are my triple constraints too. And then you get into what? Quality management, risk management, purchasing management. Those are generally business oriented, right? And then we have the human component, which is what? Resource management, my team. We also have communications, and we have our stakeholder management. And then we have integration management there at the top. Integration management ties all of this work together. So this is what you're going to see in the guide, the first 2 sections, the first big section of the PMBOK, okay? And it goes into detail. It goes into deep detail. It looks at all these 49 processes and looks at all their components, what we call inputs and outputs, right? What goes into these processes and what goes out, and also the tools and techniques inside these processes that turn inputs to outputs. So at this point, usually when I'm teaching a class, the students say, how am I ever going to memorize this? And I chuckle and I say, don't worry. It comes with practice. It just takes time. It takes time in looking at it in an appropriate way. Now, let's look at the standard. Once you finish with all those 10 knowledge areas, you have the standard. And now instead of going through knowledge areas, what do? You go through initiating, you go through planning, and you look at the processes in this way. See, each process has a knowledge area and a process group. And so with the whole book, The guide says, here's the processes, and we're going to look at it from a knowledge area standpoint. The standard says we're going to look at all these processes, but we're going to look at it from a process group standpoint. Isn't that clever? There's a lot of good detail here, right? There are. Now, the third part of the PMBOK looks at 6 appendices. Appendix 1 is what has changed, right? That would be nice to know. And there's a lot in the 6th edition that's changed. I've talked to you a little bit about it. It's not just the readability, but minor details have changed. So they lay it out very explicitly. And they actually have the authors in Appendix 2. And there's a lot of those right now. And then it looks at project environments, right? An environment that requires a very strict level of project management. We call that plan-driven. An environment that's often confusing and we don't know everything. We call that iterative and adaptive. And then we have what? Agile, where we know we're going to address great change. And so these different types of projects we explore in Appendix 3. Key concepts looks at the knowledge areas and breaks down what you need to know for each knowledge area in the PMBOK. Just a summary, okay? It's scattered throughout, but what they've done is putting it right there. And then if you have to change things, notice here, summary of tailoring considerations for the knowledge areas. If you have to modify the project, what's the best way of modifying a schedule? What are the things that you may modify in a schedule? Same thing for budget, same thing for quality. If you have to modify quality, what is easy to modify and what's difficult? And those are the type of conversations you have in that. And also, remember I was talking about those processes and their various tools and techniques that change inputs to outputs? Well, they have an entire comprehensive list of all these tools and techniques, and they tie it back to the processes themselves, which is clever. So what do we do with these appendices? Each one of them have their various uses, right? We'll look at a couple of them, see how they can function. One of the best ones I like is working with tools and techniques, because if I have one tool or a technique here and I don't know where the definition in the PMBOK is, it can point right to it for me if I know how to use these appendices. Now, there's also a glossary and there's also an index, but even those two areas have been modified and they've been simplified so you can use them easily and quickly, and you can extract the answer to your questions very easily from them. We'll look at their usefulness in a little bit, but let's go on. Now, when I say explicit topics, I mean they're easy to read, they're easy to see, okay? It means I can find them and I can organize them. And if they're written well, I can understand them well and they make sense, right? The problem is it gets really detailed. Let me show you what I mean, okay? Let's actually go into the guide, okay? And we're going to look at one of the processes. Let's just have some fun and go over to page 75. And that gives me the charter. Now, the PMBOK is really good with this. it creates a standard way to organize the data. If you want to look at the information, here's the background. Here's a great definition to understand what the processes are. And then it goes in and says, you know what? These are the components of a charter. A business case, agreements, and some other influences are required to create the charter. And by the way, it also creates something called an assumption log. So you're going to have to learn what an assumption log is. And what you can do is follow the breadcrumbs and learn what a business case is. Not just what a business case is, but what is contained in a business case. So you could take this material on page 7, 8 and use these as headlines for paragraphs, and you'd have a pretty workable business case, wouldn't you? So templates can be derived from the PMBOK pretty easily. A lot of people in my classes ask for templates, and I always show them this fact. Many of the processes in the PMBOK say, this is a good organization for that document. Well, if it's good practice, I'll start with that and I'll tailor it and see how it goes. It's all there in the PMBOK, right? Here's data gathering. Here's the team skills management and leadership. Now, it gets into detail, okay? So you have your knowledge areas and process groups, and you have the processes within these knowledge areas and process groups. And then we're decomposing these processes into their components. And you notice we're taking interpersonal and team skills here, which is a technique, and we're describing a subset of those specific tasks that are very well known to be very useful in this process. And you notice here, if we're developing the charter, it's useful to manage conflict, facilitate. Facilitation is guiding and directing and leading through the process. And meeting management, there you go. Okay, so you have a lot of information. However, you can get lost in it, right? It's highly organized in the PMBOK guide, and you notice it's codified. They have a numbering code of accounts that you can follow, and you can use that organization pretty easily, but it's really easy to get lost in the details. So documentation is going to have to be formal, but you can do it fairly easily. So it's all there, and it's very easy to find. Let me show you something else. 2 more things that make it very easy to find explicit topics, okay? I passed by a couple things here. At the beginning of the description of each process, I have 2 things. Number 1, I have the contents of the process. It's inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs, right? Number 2, I have something called a data flow diagram. Now, remember, each one of these processes has inputs and outputs. If you look at develop the charter, which is process 4.1, in the middle of the diagram here, let me get my pen out. There's something right here, and that says project charter are an output. They're an output of developing the charter. Well, that's common sense. They're an input to every other process that shows up as an arrow going to it, okay? This is linking the process developed the charter to all these other processes, okay? These linkages are almost more important than the explicit information. We'll get into those linkages in a little bit. Now, let's see here. Where's the, just one second here. If we go back here in our pages, let me clean that up really quickly. So we know the charter's coming from here, and we know where the charter's going. So the charter itself is both an output and an input. And if we understand this, we can actually trace information throughout the whole framework that goes from one place to one place and one place. So the explicit information is what's documented here. The implicit information is that we have a set of processes that are linked, and that may be important. We'll get into that discussion in a little bit. These tools and techniques are rather interesting. If you want to explore any one of these, they're generally defined every time they show up in a process, but there's one process that specifically defines it for the whole book. And it gives a little more information. And if you actually go to page 685 to one of the PMBOKs, to one of the appendices, you can see a list of all the dependencies. For instance, let's see here. Let's look at leadership. We'll come down here. Let's see, communication skills, interpersonal and team skills. Let's see, what did we say we were looking at? Facilitation, right? You'll notice that in integration management, it documents 3 processes here as using facilitation as a technique to convert inputs to outputs. And 4.1, which is highlighted, is where I can find the standard definition of what facilitation is. So it makes it really easy for you to do exploring tools and techniques, doesn't it? Next, if it's that easy for tools and techniques, what about inputs and outputs? Let's explore that. I'm going to go over to 727. Page 727 is where the index starts. Now, oops. There we are. And you'll notice it's rather complex, but if you have the PDF version, you can do things like this. Let's find an input that I'm interested in, okay? Let's call it the issue log. And there we go. I've just looked up the issue log, and what have I found? It gives me a page number for the definition. It gives me a page number where issue logs are an input. These are all the processes that actually take issue logs as an input, like managing your team. You want to know what the issues are when you're working with your team, or engaging with your stakeholders. You want to know what the issues are when you're engaging with your stakeholders, right? That's what we're saying when an issue log is an input. We also have issue logs as an output. So what we're showing here is, once again, we have these inputs and outputs that connect processes together. And we can actually look up each and every process that says, Here's where it is as an input, and here's where it is as an output. And guess what? They're probably connected in some way. Isn't that clever? And if we want to know the explicit definition of that process, we go to page 709, and we're well off for that too. So it's well organized. It wasn't this organized before the 6th edition. And this is a very handy tool for you as you're referencing it. And that's the key. It's a very good reference, the standard and the guide. It is a preferred reference. There's other material that will help you, but it's handy. So we've looked at explicit topics, right? And we've hinted at implicit topics. And let's go further into these implicit topics. When I say implicit, I mean hidden. It's not so easily exposed, okay? And it doesn't have a lot of context sometimes. They don't come out and say, you know what, this is interesting. Somebody spent 2 weeks on putting this into the PMBOK, and here's the reason. They don't do that, right? They don't say that, but it's there for your discovery. How do I discover? The patterns, okay? Just like when you're looking at data, you don't look at random data because that's normal data. You look at the patterns. The patterns have the great information. When people are overwhelmed with the amount of material they need to memorize, I tell them, don't memorize every detail. Every detail could be on the exam, but you can actually compress a lot of those details into patterns and rules. Let me show you something here. This may not make a lot of sense for us right now, but if you were to go into the class, it would be a very interesting discussion. Let's go back to page 75. Okay, this is a pattern that we see, and nobody talks about it in the PMBOK. It's not spelled out, but it's still there. We have expert judgment, and we have facilitation. What this means is, when I'm developing the charter, I facilitate, I guide, I don't participate. I make sure the processes are followed. Expert judgment is my subject experts. And so what we're saying is, we lead and direct our experts, and we ensure the process is followed. Well, that makes sense in the charter, right? Let's go to another process that's in planning. And this pattern is common to a lot of planning processes. And instead of developing the charter, let's just go and develop the plan. I think it's the next process. Let me get the page for you real quickly here. It's over on page 82. There we are. There's our expert judgment right here. And here's our facilitation. Now, we have other things in developing the plan, but we also have that pattern. And this is the key. If you look at patterns, they're telling you something, especially when those patterns show up over and over and over again. And these two techniques, these two tools, are a constant addition to the tools and techniques, especially in the planning processes. What does it mean? Well, the Code of Ethics, the Project Management Institute Code of Ethics says that it's best and it's the right thing to do for the manager to be objective. Make sure that they're not swaying the vote, and they make sure that all the voices are heard. That is thoroughly integrated into these planning processes, aren't they? Isn't that interesting? This is how a lot of these code of ethics questions are integrated into the PMBOK. You can't find them quickly, and sometimes it takes an expert to point them out to you. And there are many, many other processes that we can look at, and many, many other examples. But I see we're running out of time, and it looks as if I need to start closing if we're going to have any questions. I don't know if we have questions today. This is a lot we're talking about. But I want you to really start looking for patterns. Now, for the PMBOK and preparation for the PMP exam, it's almost a requirement to do this, right? Start looking for these patterns, especially on the material that you're struggling with, and it'll answer a lot of your questions many times. And honestly, having an expert or mentor, somebody who's passed the exam or somebody who teaches this, is really a handy help here. Now, wrapping all this up, how do I use this guidance standard? How do I use to prepare it? Well, I said it's handy for using it. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I've met about 100 to 150 new students a month, okay? And they came back to the forum and they said, I passed. And I said, this is great. And so all of a sudden, a lot of them were saying, here's how I prepared. And I said, that's even better. And I started collecting this data. And it seems that from the results of this broad, informal, and highly unscientific analysis, that about 40% of the people who prepare for the exam going through our programs seem to like to read it, and they seem to say it was helpful. Read it from end to end. We're talking about 600 pages though, and that takes dedication, doesn't it? Well, 100% of it said it was my primary reference and it helped me. What do we mean by reference? We mean they opened it up when they had a problem. They went to the source material that they thought was the answer. They reviewed and they assessed and they cleared their doubts. Or an expert or a mentor said, go to page 78, look at that paragraph, read it to me and tell me what it means, right? So it's like an encyclopedia or Wikipedia. That's probably the best use for you to start off with. Now, if you know that you like to read standards documents, don't let me stop you. I don't, and I didn't. I felt a little bad when I was preparing, but because I just couldn't get through it. But what I could get through was every time I got a practice question wrong, I could find out the details from the scenario of the question and the 4 options, and I could easily go to the PMBOK and read up the reference, and that clarified my doubt. And that's what we're talking about. Go in, find specific information you need. I've showed you a few ways to do it, and then use that to answer your question. That's the way you're going to do it. And it's all about why. It's not how and what. The PMBOK guide has always been good at how and what. It's getting really good at explaining why. And I do want to say, you can do this on your own. I've met a very few people who did it in isolation. I've met a lot of people who did it in peer groups successfully, but the ones who most successfully do it are the ones who find somebody who's really good at it. Experts, right? Trainers, mentors, leaders, and anyway, anybody with a PMP should have enough knowledge to at least support you. And they've taken an oath to help you too. Okay, that's all I have today, everyone. I will wait for a couple of questions if you're interested. We don't have a lot of time, but please This is a very important topic. We don't have enough time to talk in our classes about how do I specifically use this document to prepare. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to present this today. Okay. I want to thank you for your interest. And if you're reviewing a recording, I want to thank you for coming out and taking the effort of reviewing this. Please post your comments. Please come over and talk with us and give us information over at Ijona Academy, and look for more webinars, both the recordings and the ones in the future. If you would like to talk about anything, I've been talking about this for over 16 years, and I've been doing research over research. So I'm a good source material. And one thing you'll get from me is both sides of it. I have no issue in debating these topics, and I know which ones are highly debatable. But at the same time, I would rather that you exercise your thought processes, and I'll help you decide what you think is right. That's what the powerful thing about mentors are. What's most important is that you're making your life better, and you're learning skills that are not just going to get a credential, but they're also going to get you moving towards the destination that you deserve. I want to thank you again. Come and visit us over at the website. Visit us over at LinkedIn. We're there and we're talking every week. And like I said, if you have further questions, post them over at the Ijona Academy website. And if they're a question that you really need, we're happy to put together a webinar, or at least answer your questions in one way or another. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great path towards your personal development, and we'll continue our discussions moving forward. Thanks again.